Welcome back to Mr. Biegalski's English class. Hi guys, welcome back. Hope everyone is healthy. Hope everyone is doing well. I hope you had fun writing your short stories. They should be coming in, or they should be in by now. If they're not yet, please get them in as soon as possible and hand them in on Google Classroom. And we are going to get on with the poetry unit. So you guys have done the introduction to the poetry unit. Also hand in those 7 questions on the poetry essay that I assigned the other day. But let's talk about poetry. And the first thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about the history of poetry, because poetry's been around for a very long time. In fact, the oldest stories we have are all stories that are poems. So from your introduction to poetry, you guys know that prose tends to be more analytical, more kind of everyday speech, and poetry is kind of more emotional, more based on feelings and images that you present. You know, you present an image here, an image there, and you build the story that way through poetry, whereas prose just kind of more comes out and says it. And the difference between poetry and prose is not like a hard division difference. There isn't, you know, a line, and on one side of the line there is poetry, and on the other side there's prose. It's kind of a continuum, and you can get prose that is very poetic. Someone like Margaret Atwood, who writes novels in prose, is very poetic because she has also published books of poetry, and she uses those literary devices and those poetic devices in order to enrich her prose writing. And then some poetry is very prosy. It tells a story, very much, you know, a sequential story that, goes through a bunch of events. So the difference is kind of subtle. And different people have talents in different types of writing. So if you're excellent at essays, for example, if you're very analytical, you have an analytical mind, you may excel in the writing of prose, but you might have trouble writing poetry. You might have trouble getting your mind around the idea of just writing your feelings down. And maybe a person who doesn't excel at writing essays could excel at writing poetry because they're more in touch with their feelings and they're more in touch with the kind of ethereal part of their being, I guess. And so it's interesting to see that some people who have never been good at English might be very, very good at writing poetry, and other people who are excellent at writing essays might struggle and might think, you know, how do I do this thing? Now, I want to get on to talking about different types of poetry. We're going to start by talking about the history of poetry, and poetry is in fact some of the oldest writing we know. The first stories that were ever told were told in poetry. Ancient poetry tends to be divided into sort of 2 classes. There is epic poetry and lyric poetry. Now, epic poetry is concerned with great deeds. Epic poetry is concerned usually with a hero. Usually this is someone who is very strong physically, maybe a warrior type, and that person goes on a quest and saves the world through their deeds or does something great for the world. And that type of storytelling still lives on. You have stories like Lord of the Rings, and you have stories like all of the Marvel comic book stories. These are epic stories where the heroes are concerned with saving the world from some great evil. Now, lyric poetry, on the other hand, is concerned more with personal things, personal feelings and thoughts and introspection and looking into one's own soul and maturing as a human being. So these are poems concerned not with great deeds, but more with, you know, what's going on inside you, inside your mind, inside your soul. Today, we're going to focus on epic poetry. I want to start by looking at the very oldest stories told in any language, and also the very oldest stories told in the English language. Now, the reason the oldest stories were written in poetry was because they were written to be performed. Back then, when these stories were written, no one knew how to read, so a poet wouldn't write down a story for people to read. There were no novels or anything like that. So what they did was they came up with a dynamic way of telling these stories and wrote them down in these poetic terms to be performed by people who were called rhapsodes. Rhapsodes were kind of like the rock stars of the ancient world. They traveled from town to town and recited poems in front of groups of people. And sometimes these recitations could take a couple hours to retell. If you're telling a story of, say, the Trojan War, like in Homer's The Iliad, this is a very long story. If you buy a book of this story, this will take you hours to read. And these rhapsodes would come into a town and get fed and get put up for the night and get paid, and they would recite the story of these great deeds by Achilles and Hector and other heroes, and they would emotionally get involved in the story. They would cry in the sad parts and laugh in the happy parts and so on. And this was the town entertainment. Remember, there's no TV, there's no radio, there's no internet at that time, and people didn't go more than a few miles away from the town where they lived. So they had no way of being entertained other than the occasional person coming in and telling stories and bringing news from the outside world. So today we're going to focus on 3 epic stories, and the first one is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And this is the oldest story that has ever been found from ancient civilizations. It dates back, I think, something like 4,000 years, and it dates back to ancient Mesopotamia. It's a story of a king, and this is the king of Uruk, the city Uruk, and he goes off on a quest to achieve immortality. I'm also going to focus on 2 other stories. One is the Iliad, as I mentioned before. This was an ancient Greek story of the Greek invasion of Troy. Of course, the story of Helen of Troy. This is told in the movie Troy with Brad Pitt in it. But, of course, it's based on the epic poem by Homer. And the third one is Beowulf, which is the oldest story told in the English language. This is the story of Beowulf, a hero who is hired by a Danish king to kill a great beast called Grendel, who is plaguing his kingdom. So what I've done for this lesson is I'm including some YouTube videos that summarize each of these stories. So give these videos a watch. And also I've scanned the opening lines of each of these 3 poems for you, translated into English, of course, modern English. And I want you guys to read the introductions to each of these 3 poems. The Iliad one is really short. The other 2 are a little bit longer. But in each case, each poem starts the same way. It starts by introducing the hero of the poem, so Gilgamesh or Achilles or Beowulf. And in each case, this introduction is wildly exaggerated. So there's this celebration of the hero, and their deeds are kind of told in exaggerated terms and exaggerated language. And there's some wonderfully inventive stuff in there. In Beowulf, for example, the sea is described as a whale path. I really enjoy reading these kind of exaggerated descriptions because that's something we don't get every day anymore. In the ancient world, it was perfectly okay to brag, whereas in our world, it's kind of frowned upon. So in each of these stories, the hero's deeds are sort of celebrated and bragged about, whereas in our society, modesty has become a real virtue, and so we don't do that anymore. But this is one of the differences between our world and the ancient world. Is that modesty was not really a thing back then. So you could brag as much as you wanted, and the more you brag, the more kind of people went, whoa, this person's cool. So what I want to do for this assignment that's coming up is we're going to restart the journal. Now, I have your physical journals, but you can restart sort of an electronic one and submit your journal entries that way. But what I want you to do is actually write the 8th journal entry. And that 8th journal entry is going to be a poem. And what I want you to do is kind of mimic what's happening in these 3 introductions. I want you to write the introduction of an epic hero. It doesn't have to be in some fancy Middle English dialect or anything like that. You can do it in modern English, but introduce someone in these massively exaggerated terms. You can pick yourself, you can pick a famous person, you can pick a person you know, and you can pick a friend from the class. Talk about their deeds and their qualities in these awesome terms. Make them look heroic. This should be no more than a page long, double spaced. Half a page is maybe a little short, maybe 3/4 a page to a page long poem where you introduce a person in heroic terms. So that's your next journal, and I want you to ham it up. I want you to make it cheesy. I don't want you to be trying to be a serious poet right now. We're just going to have fun with this. Write that journal in the next couple of days, and I'm going to post the next assignment in a couple of days. All right, so guys, thanks for listening. Good luck with your poetic assignment. If you have any questions, please ask me, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. I'm going to post that assignment along with this video, and I'll let you guys do your thing and get on with the work. Okay, bye. Biegalski's English class.